Please watch Part 2 for a better understanding of this. Chapter 31. The Unraveling Web. The warehouse bust had made headlines across Longchen's city. The successful rescue of Lin Fei was praised, and Chief Su's team was heralded as heroes. But behind the scenes, Su Ming felt a quiet discontent brewing. The case wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sitting in his father's office, Su Ming replayed the past few days' events in his mind. The traffickers they captured had been small-time players, nothing more than pawns in a larger game. The auction symbol, the underground connections, the network that seemed to span across borders were all clues to something much more dangerous lurking in the shadows. "Your mother's going to be on my back for letting you get involved," Chief Su said, breaking the silence as he glanced at his son from across the desk. His stern expression softened slightly, but there was still a hint of worry behind his eyes. "You know she wanted you to focus on school, not get caught up in such cases." Su Ming shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "It wasn't my choice, Dad. You know how it goes with me. Crime seemed to follow me wherever I go." Chief Su sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Still, you're not an official investigator yet, even if you have the brains for it. What you did was impressive, but I don't want you diving too deep into this world before you're ready." Su Ming gave a lazy smile. "I'm not planning to. I prefer to keep things quiet and live a simple life. But sometimes life has other plans." Chief Su chuckled at that, though his tone remained serious. "You've got a sharp mind, but don't let that be your downfall. The people we're dealing with, this is no ordinary group. The auction symbol you found is tied to an international black market that's been operating under the radar for years. They're highly organized, well-funded, and ruthless. You got lucky this time, but we're just scratching the surface." Su Ming's mind whirred with possibilities. His father wasn't wrong. This wasn't some local crime ring. What they had stumbled upon was something that spanned across borders, a global trafficking network. It wasn't the first time Su Ming had heard of such operations, and his contacts in the global intelligence network had whispered about these kinds of dealings before. "I'll be careful," Su Ming said, giving his father a reassuring look. "I won't bite off more than I can chew." Chief Su nodded, but there was still a glimmer of doubt in his eyes. "Just don't let your curiosity drag you into something you can't get out of." Later that afternoon, Su Ming was in his room, sifting through the intel he had received from his contacts in the global network. He didn't want to get too deep into the criminal world again, but his mind wouldn't rest. The symbol, the trafficking ring, the sheer scale of it was all pulling him in like a puzzle that begged to be solved. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from one of his most trusted contacts within the network. More info on the auction group. They've been active for decades, operating in several countries. Their reach is deep, even into law enforcement and politics. This won't be easy to shut down. Su Ming frowned. That confirmed his suspicions. Whoever was behind this operation wasn't just selling people. They were entrenched in the system, with connections everywhere. Taking them down would be like cutting off the head of a hydra. For every piece they dismantled, two more would grow in its place. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. This was the kind of situation he hated. Too complicated, too messy, too many layers to unravel. But there was no turning back now. Lin Fei's rescue had only been the beginning, and Su Ming knew that these traffickers wouldn't stop unless someone made them. The next day, Su Ming found himself at the family estate, enjoying a rare moment of peace. His sixth sister, Su Qing, had invited him over for tea, a welcome distraction from the chaos of the investigation. As they sat in the garden, Su Qing smiled at him. "I heard you cracked another case. You're really starting to make a name for yourself, even though you try so hard to avoid the spotlight." Su Ming waved her off, his usual laziness seeping into his tone. "It's not like I asked for it. Things just happen." Su Qing chuckled. "That's always been your problem. You attract trouble like a magnet. But I'm glad you're staying out of danger for now." Su Ming sipped his tea, trying to relax. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and for a moment, he allowed himself to enjoy the peacefulness of it all. But in the back of his mind, the wheels kept turning. The investigation, the auction group, the international network, it all loomed over him like a dark cloud. "How's everything at work?" Su Ming asked, shifting the conversation away from himself. Su Ming sighed. Busy, as usual. I've been working on a new exhibition, but it's been delayed because of some logistical issues. You know how it is? Everyone's got their agenda, and sometimes it feels like you're just spinning in circles. Su Ming nodded. That sounded all too familiar. Even in the world of crime solving, everyone has their motives. The same could be said for the underground networks he dealt with. Criminals, informants, law enforcement, they all had their angles. After finishing their tea, Su Ming bid his sister farewell, his mind already drifting back to the case. He wasn't officially part of the police yet, and his father had warned him to stay out of it, but the puzzle was too enticing. It was the kind of challenge he couldn't ignore, even if it meant getting dragged into something dangerous. Back in his room, Su Ming stared at the investigation board he had set up. The auction group symbol was at the center, with lines branching out to various leads, locations, and possible connections. His eyes scanned the board, searching for the next piece of the puzzle. A knock on the door broke his concentration. "Come in," he called out. His fifth sister, Su Yi, the Special Forces captain, stepped inside. She rarely visited unless it was something important. "Su Ming, I need your help," she said, her tone unusually serious. Su Ming raised an eyebrow. Su, he wasn't one to ask for help unless it was absolutely necessary. "What's going on?" "There's a case I've been working on with my unit," Sui began, her voice steady but laced with tension. "It's connected to a string of child abductions in a neighboring province. We thought we had leads, but they've gone cold. I heard about what you did with Lin Fei. I think you might be able to help us crack this one." Su Ming frowned, his mind already racing through possibilities. Another set of child abductions? Could they be connected to the auction group? Or was this something entirely different? "Tell me everything," Su Ming said, leaning forward. He had a feeling this was going to be another case that would pull him in, whether he wanted to get involved or not. Chapter 32, A Dark Trail. The room grew tense as Su Yi laid out the details of the case. Su Ming listened intently, his lazy demeanor fading as his sharp mind came alive with each new piece of information. The case was worse than he had imagined. "It started about 2 months ago," Sui explained, pacing the room. "Children between the ages of 6 and 10 have been disappearing from rural areas in the neighboring province. At first, we thought it was just random kidnappings, but when the number reached 10, we realized it was something far more organized." Su Ming's eyes narrowed. "Any witnesses? Ransom notes? Anything tying these cases together?" Sui shook her head. "No demands, no traces. The only connection we've found is a single black feather left at each crime scene." "A black feather?" Su Ming repeated, his mind whirring. "Symbolic. Maybe his signature." "That's what we thought," Sui continued. "My unit has been combing through every lead, every possible connection, but so far we've come up with nothing. It's like these kids vanish into thin air." Su Ming stood up from his chair, pacing as well. His sister wasn't exaggerating. This was no ordinary case. The systematic nature of the abductions, the lack of evidence, and the sheer number of victims pointed to a highly skilled and organized group. And that black feather, it could be a clue or a message. But to whom? "You think this is connected to the trafficking group we just busted?" Sui asked, her voice low. Su Ming paused, considering the possibility. It wasn't out of the question. If this group had ties to international crime syndicates, child abductions could be just one part of their operations. The children could be used for all manner of illegal activities, slave labor, organ trafficking, or worse. "It's possible," Su Ming admitted. "But it could also be a different group entirely. We need more information." Su Yi nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that. My unit is planning to move in on a location we suspect is being used to hold the children. It's an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the province, deep in the forest. We're going in tomorrow night." Su Ming's instincts immediately flared up. "That sounds like a trap." Su Yi smirked. "You think I don't know that? My team is prepared, but we need someone who can think outside the box. That's why I'm asking you." Su Ming chuckled lightly. "So you're saying you want me to tag along and be your ace in the hole?" Su Yi crossed her arms. "Pretty much. You're good at seeing things others miss. I think you'll be able to help us crack this case wide open." Su Ming sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He had wanted to avoid getting involved, But now that the pieces were on the table, his curiosity was piqued. The black feather, the missing children, the possibility of a larger conspiracy. It was too much to ignore. "Fine," he said, finally relenting. "I'll come along. But you'd better not get me killed, Su-yi." Su-yi smiled, the tension between them easing for a moment. "Wouldn't dream of it, little brother." The next evening, Su Ming found himself crouched behind a row of dense bushes, the cold night air biting at his skin. The warehouse loomed ahead, its weathered structure barely visible through the thick trees. Su-yi's Special Forces team had spread out, silently moving into position. Su Ming adjusted the earpiece in his ear, listening to the low chatter of the team as they communicated. His heart beat steadily, but his mind was already calculating potential escape routes, the positioning of guards, and possible traps. This was a high-stakes operation, and he had no intention of letting it go sideways. Through the darkness, he caught sight of Su-yi a few meters away. She gave him a brief nod, signaling that it was time to move. Su Ming followed her lead, moving silently toward the side entrance of the warehouse. As they approached the door, Su-yi signaled for her team to breach. In one swift motion, the door was kicked open, and the team flooded inside, weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the dim interior. Su Ming stayed back, his eyes scanning the surroundings for anything out of place. The warehouse was eerily silent, its interior filled with dusty crates and old machinery. There were no signs of the children, at least not yet. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the building. Su Ming's instincts kicked in, and he ducked behind a stack of crates just as a hail of gunfire erupted from the far side of the warehouse. Su-yi's team returned fire, moving with precision and discipline as they advanced toward the source of the gunfire. Su Ming peeked out from behind the crates, his eyes quickly assessing the situation. There were at least 6 armed men, using the machinery as cover. But something felt off. The attackers were too spread out, their movements too calculated for this to be a simple ambush. "This isn't right," Su Ming muttered to himself. He reached for his earpiece. "Su-yi, pull back. This is a setup," but it was too late. As the gunfire continued, Su Ming heard a faint click, followed by a low rumble beneath his feet. His eyes widened as he realized what was happening. There were explosives rigged throughout the building. Without hesitation, Su Ming bolted from his hiding spot, sprinting towards Su-yi. "Get out of here! Now!" Su-yi didn't need to be told twice. She barked orders to her team, and they began a swift retreat, covering each other as they made their way back toward the exit. The ground shook as the first explosion went off, sending debris flying through the air. Su Ming felt the heat of the blast at his back as he dove behind a metal beam, narrowly avoiding the shrapnel. "Su Ming!" Su-yi's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Where are you?" "I'm fine," Su Ming shouted, though the ringing in his ears suggested otherwise. "Just get your team out." As the smoke filled the warehouse, Su Ming crawled toward the exit, keeping low to avoid the collapsing ceiling. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what had gone wrong. The black feather, the abductions, the warehouse. It was all part of a larger plan, one designed to throw them off the real trail. By the time he staggered outside, Su-yi and her team were already regrouping, shaken but alive. "You okay?" Su-yi asked, her face smeared with dirt and soot. Su Ming nodded, still catching his breath. "Yeah, but this wasn't just an ambush. They wanted us here. Whoever's behind this is playing a much bigger game." Su-yi frowned. "So what now?" Su Ming glanced back at the smoldering warehouse, his mind already working on the next steps. "We follow the trail. This isn't over yet." Chapter 33. The Elusive Burglar. Su Ming lounged on the couch, his body draped lazily across it like a cat basking in the afternoon sun. His eyelids drooped as he absently scrolled through news articles on his tablet, hoping for a quiet day. The last case had left him mentally drained, and all he wanted was a moment of peace. Maybe a nice nap, or perhaps some good food, and just the serenity of not dealing with crime. But fate had other plans. Just as he settled deeper into his comfortable silence, his phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it at first, hoping it would stop, When it didn't, he sighed heavily and grabbed the phone. It was a message from his father. "Another case. Are you up for it?" Su Ming groaned. "Why can't the criminals just take a day off?" "Just one," he muttered. He typed a quick response, though he already knew what his decision would be. "Do I have a choice?" "No. It's a high-profile burglary case. We could use your insight." Sighing deeply, Su Ming tossed the phone aside and got up. So much for a quiet afternoon. An hour later, Su Ming found himself standing outside one of the most luxurious mansions in Longshan. The estate belonged to a prominent businessman, Mr. Wu, known for his connections to several influential families in the city. Last night, his mansion had been broken into, and several priceless items were stolen, including an ancient jade necklace worth millions. Su Ming stood beside his father, who was busy talking to one of the investigators. His father glanced over at him. "You look tired." Su Ming shrugged. "I am tired. Can't this be solved by the regular police force? It's just a burglary." His father chuckled softly. "You'll see why this one's different." They walked inside, and the atmosphere in the mansion was tense. Investigators were combing through the place, dusting for fingerprints and taking photographs of the crime scene. Su Ming's eyes quickly scanned the surroundings, mentally taking note of the layout and the missing items as described by the head investigator. "So," Su Ming said, rubbing his chin, "how'd they get in?" The investigator, a sharp-eyed man named Officer Lei, pointed toward the massive glass windows that overlooked the garden. "Broke in through the skylight in the back, climbed down using a rope, bypassed all the security measures." Su Ming raised an eyebrow. "Impressive. How many people?" "We're thinking just one," Officer Lei replied. "There are no signs of multiple intruders, and the work was clean." This isn't the first time something like this has happened either. There have been similar high-profile burglaries across the city, but this is the first time they've hit a place this heavily secured. Su Ming walked closer to the window, examining it carefully. He knelt, noticing the precision with which the glass had been cut. It wasn't the work of some petty thief. Whoever had done this was a professional. "No alarms went off?" he asked. Officer Lei shook his head. "None. It's like they knew exactly how to avoid triggering them." Su Ming stood up, stretching his arms above his head. "So we're dealing with a highly skilled burglar. Likely has experience with sophisticated security systems. They've done this before, and they're confident." His father watched him with a curious expression. "You've barely been here 10 minutes, and you're already profiling the criminal." Su Ming grinned lazily. "What can I say? It's a talent." As they continued to walk through the mansion, Su Ming's mind wandered through various possibilities. A burglar this skilled had to have a certain amount of knowledge about security systems. Perhaps they had inside information, or maybe they were just incredibly good at what they did. "Any idea where the stolen goods could be?" his father asked. Su Ming rubbed his temples. "If I were them, I'd lay low for a while, wait until the heat dies down before trying to move anything. Selling the jade necklace immediately would be risky, especially considering how famous it is. This person's smart, so they'll probably hold on to it for a while before attempting to sell it on the black market." Officer Lei nodded. "We've already contacted the local black market informants. If the thief tries to sell, we'll hear about it." Su Ming leaned against the wall, contemplating. "We should look into any major security system experts or insiders who might have been bribed or coerced. Also, check for anyone recently released from prison who had a history of burglary. They may have been planning this for a while." His father nodded in agreement. "Good thinking." Just as Su Ming was about to suggest more avenues to investigate, a thought crossed his mind. He turned to Officer Lei. "What about the garden?" "The garden?" Lei asked, slightly confused. "We've already combed it for evidence." Su Ming waved his hand. Have you looked up?" Officer Lei frowned, but he motioned for his team to follow Su Ming's lead. They stepped outside, and Su Ming stared up at the tall, towering trees surrounding the mansion's property. His eyes landed on the thick branches, and a small smile crept across his face. "If I were a skilled burglar," Su Ming said slowly, "I'd use the trees as cover. They're high enough to avoid being seen from the ground, and with the right equipment, you could zip line in and out, no problem." Officer Lei blinked in surprise. "That makes sense. But how would they get the equipment up there without anyone noticing?" Su Ming gave a lazy shrug. They probably did it over time, scouted the place, made preparations, and waited for the right moment to strike. His father stared at the trees, impressed. "You don't miss much, do you?" Su Ming chuckled. "I just like puzzles. And this one's starting to come together." Officer Lei ordered his team to search the trees for any signs of equipment, and sure enough, they found the remnants of a zip line hidden within the branches. It was a clever setup, one that allowed the thief to bypass the mansion's security systems entirely by staying out of sight. Su Ming leaned against the tree, looking up at the sky. "You'll catch them soon. This thief's good, but they're bound to slip up eventually. People like that always do." Chapter 34. The trap is set. After identifying the method used by the burglar, Su Ming had hoped the case would be straightforward. However, as days passed, there were no significant breakthroughs. The thief had disappeared, leaving behind little evidence other than the broken skylight and the hidden zip line. Su Ming, as usual, tried to distance himself from the case, preferring to immerse himself in his lazy routine. But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the unsolved crime gnawed at his mind. The idea that a criminal this skilled was still out there, possibly planning their next move, made him restless. His father, as persistent as ever, hadn't let up either. He called Su Ming almost daily, updating him on the progress, or lack thereof, being made by the investigation team. Still nothing solid, his father's message read one morning. "They've gone completely dark." Su Ming, lounging in his room, groaned. "I knew it wouldn't be easy. But do I have to get involved again?" Still, his curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his tablet and began reviewing the details of the case once more. One detail, however small, continued to nag at him: the timing. The break-in had occurred when Mr. Wu was away at an important event, something that had been widely publicized. How did the thief know Mr. Wu's schedule so precisely? Su Ming muttered to himself. It wasn't just luck. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that the thief had inside help. Someone with access to Mr. Wu's personal information had provided the details. But who? He called his father. "You think it was an inside job?" his father asked, sounding both surprised and impressed. "I do," Su Ming replied, his tone lazy but confident. "Check Mr. Wu's staff. Someone must have tipped off the burglar." The next day, Su Ming's father called with an update. "You were right. We looked into the staff, and one of the security guards has been acting suspiciously. He took several days off after the burglary and hasn't shown up to work since." Su Ming smiled to himself. "There's your man. Any idea where he went?" "Not yet, but we're tracking him down." "Good. I'd set a trap for the burglar too. Let them think they're safe and lure them into making a move." "Already on it. We've beefed up security at several similar properties and have eyes on the black market for any sign of the stolen items." Su Ming hung up the phone, satisfied. For now, the wheels were in motion, and he didn't need to do much more. A week later, the trap was set. Su Ming's father had coordinated with several high-profile families in Longshan, leaking false information about valuable items being transported to secure locations. The hope was that the burglar, or their insider, would take the bait. Su Ming, as usual, tried to avoid getting too involved. He preferred to observe from the sidelines. But, as fate would have it, crime followed him like a shadow. He was out at a local cafe, enjoying a rare moment of peace when his phone buzzed. It was his father again. "They took the bait." Su Ming sighed, setting down his cup of tea. "Already? They're trying to hit a property we set up with the fake items. Then what are you waiting for?" Su Ming said lazily. "Catch them. We are, but we could use your eyes on this. You saw something we didn't last time." Grumbling under his breath, Su Ming stood up and left the cafe. "I better be getting some good food out of this," he muttered. When Su Ming arrived at the scene, the operation was already in full swing. The police had surrounded the targeted property, and the tension in the air was palpable. His father greeted him as soon as he stepped out of the car. "You're just in time," his father said with a grin. "The burglar's inside, and we're about to move in." Su Ming yawned, feigning disinterest. "What am I supposed to do? I'm not a police officer." "You don't need to be. Just do what you do best." Su Ming rolled his eyes, but followed his father into the command center that had been set up nearby. Inside, Several officers were monitoring live footage from security cameras installed around the property. Su Ming watched the screens closely, taking in every detail. "How did they get in this time?" he asked. "They used the same method. Zip line from the trees. Figures. They're predictable now." Su Ming studied the screens more closely. The burglar, clad in all black, was moving swiftly through the house, heading directly for the fake vault that had been set up as part of the trap. But something felt off to Su Ming. "Wait," Su Ming said suddenly. "There's more than one." His father looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Su Ming pointed at one of the screens. "Look at the shadows. They're moving too quickly. This isn't just one person. It's at least two." His father turned to the officers. "Get eyes on the other parts of the property. If there's a second person, we need to find them." Within minutes, the police had confirmed Su Ming's hunch. Another figure, dressed in the same black outfit, was sneaking around the back of the property, clearly acting as a lookout. "Looks like they brought backup this time," Su Ming said with a smirk. "You better hurry before they make a run for it." With Su Ming's quick observation, the police moved in swiftly, apprehending both burglars before they could escape. It was a clean operation, and within hours, the stolen items from the previous burglary were recovered from their hideout. As the police wrapped up the case, Su Ming stood off to the side, watching with his usual lazy expression. "You are something," his father said, coming over to stand beside him. "You figured out there were two of them in just a few minutes." Su Ming shrugged. "It was obvious. People always make mistakes. You just have to know where to look." His father laughed. "You're wasted being lazy, you know that?" Su Ming grinned. "I like being lazy. It's easier that way." Chapter 35. A Dangerous Puzzle. After solving the burglary case, Su Ming thought he'd finally have some peace. For a brief moment, it seemed like things would calm down. But as usual, fate had other plans. His father's phone call came early in the morning, just when Su Ming was savoring the first quiet breakfast he'd had in days. With a resigned sigh, he answered. "We have a situation," his father said in a grave tone. Su Ming raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in his father's voice. This wasn't just another petty crime or burglary. "What's wrong?" 10 children have been murdered. It's all over the news. I need you to come down here. It's bad." Su Ming's grip tightened on the phone. 10 children murdered? His mind raced with the implications. Cases involving children were always the most emotionally charged and complicated. It wasn't just about catching the killer. It was about dealing with the grief, fear, and chaos left in their wake. By the time Su Ming arrived at the police station, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Officers moved briskly through the halls, their expressions grim and focused. Su Ming's father was waiting for him in his office, looking more worn out than usual. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The children were found in different parts of the country. We're looking at a serial killer. The media is calling it the 10 Shadows case." Su Ming sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. 10 murders across different locations? That's not easy to pull off. Whoever did this, they're meticulous. His father handed him a file. "We've linked the murders through similar methods of execution, but there's no clear motive. The families of the victims had no connection to each other. No ransom notes, no demands." Su Ming flipped through the file, his sharp eyes scanning the gruesome details. The children were all killed in the same way, clean, precise. There were no signs of struggle, no clues left behind at the scenes. "It's almost like they disappeared without a trace," Su Ming muttered. His father nodded. "We're already under immense pressure. The country is in an uproar. The public wants answers, and fast." Su Ming leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He could already feel the headache building. This wasn't just a case about finding a killer. It was about stopping a nationwide panic. "What's the president's stance on this?" "He's personally involved now," his father said. "He's ordered an immediate task force, and I'm heading it. But I need you, Su Ming. We can't afford to make mistakes here." For a moment, Su Ming considered walking away. He could tell his father that this wasn't his problem, that he was done with cases like this. But deep down, he knew he couldn't leave something like this unsolved. Not when innocent lives had been lost in such a brutal way. "All right," Su Ming said quietly. "I'll help, but we need to think outside the box for this one." Whoever did this isn't going to slip up easily. The investigation into the 10 Shadows case started in full force. Su Ming, despite his usual reluctance, found himself drawn deeper into the mystery. He spent hours combing through police reports, studying the victims, their families, and any possible connections. Days passed, and still, there were no significant leads. The killer was careful, almost too careful, leaving behind no traceable evidence. But Su Ming wasn't the type to give up. One evening, as he sat alone in his room, piecing together fragments of information, something clicked in his mind. "It's a pattern," he whispered to himself. Each of the murders had occurred near specific landmarks, places that on their own seemed unrelated. But when Su Ming mapped them out, they formed a subtle, almost unnoticeable shape. "A triangle. No, a star," he muttered, staring at the map he had created. The killer had been following a pattern all along, using the locations of the murders to create a symbol. But why? What did it mean? Su Ming presented his findings to his father and the task force the next day. "It's not random," he explained, pointing to the map. "The killer is moving in a specific pattern, using the locations to form a shape. This symbol," he traced the points on the map, "might be the key to figuring out their next move." The room fell silent as everyone studied the map. His father was the first to speak. "Are you saying they're planning another murder?" Su Ming nodded grimly. "I'd bet on it. If we can figure out the next point in the pattern, we can stop them before they strike again." The task force sprang into action, analyzing every detail of Su Ming's theory. It was a race against time to predict the killer's next move. After hours of intense work, the next location was narrowed down, a small, rural village far from the bustling cities. Su Ming's father immediately organized a team to head there, hoping to catch the killer before they could strike again. Su Ming, as usual, remained in the background, his mind racing with possibilities. The killer was smart, but Su Ming was smarter. He just needed to stay one step ahead. The night was tense as the police staked out the village. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every sound magnified by the weight of what was at stake. Su Ming, though he had planned to stay out of it, found himself on the scene, observing from a distance. His father's team was in position, ready to act at the first sign of the killer. And then, just before dawn, the trap was sprung. The killer appeared, moving quietly through the village, completely unaware that they were being watched. The police moved in swiftly, surrounding the suspect before they had a chance to escape. Su Ming watched from the sidelines, a mix of relief and satisfaction washing over him. The case wasn't fully over yet. There would be interrogations and investigations into the killer's motives. But for now, the children of the country were safe. Chapter 36, A Fragile Peace. Su Ming stepped into the grand entrance of the Su family's estate, feeling an unusual sense of unease. Family reunions weren't his favorite, especially when tensions ran high. As the youngest child in a family filled with successful and powerful figures, Su Ming often found himself at the center of subtle but unmistakable scrutiny. "You're late again," his eldest sister Su Yanjing said sharply, barely looking up from her tablet. The eldest of the Su siblings, she was a no-nonsense businesswoman who had little patience for Su Ming's easygoing attitude. Su Ming just shrugged, slouching into the nearest chair with a casual smile. "Traffic. You live 10 minutes away," Su Yanjing retorted, not hiding her disbelief. Ignoring her, Su Ming glanced around the room. His other sisters were all present. Su Jing, the famous singer, was chatting quietly with Su Wei, the genius hacker who barely ever left her laptop. Su Yi, the Special Forces captain, stood near the window, looking out with her usual stoic expression. The room was a mixture of strong personalities, each sibling excelling in their field, but Su Ming often felt like an outlier. The family dinner was scheduled to start in a few minutes, but the tension in the room hinted that this wasn't just a social gathering. Their father, the chief of criminal police, had called for the meeting with a stern expression earlier that week, and Su Ming had the feeling something important was about to be discussed. Once the meal was underway, it didn't take long for the topic to surface. Their father, sitting at the head of the table, cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. The Su family's influence is being closely watched right now. He began, his tone heavy. There have been some whispers about how much power we wield in various sectors. People are starting to get uncomfortable. Su E, never one to mince words, spoke up. Let them be uncomfortable. We've worked hard for our positions. Their father shook his head. It's not that simple. The political climate is changing. Factions within the government are starting to question our family's role in high-profile cases, especially since Su Ming's name has been tied to so many recently. Su Ming, who had been quietly sipping his tea, raised an eyebrow. Me? I've been keeping a low profile. Su Jing smirked from across the table. Low profile? You can't step outside without running into some kind of crime. It's like you have a magnet for trouble. Su Ming rolled his eyes, but he couldn't deny it. Crime seemed to follow him wherever he went, even when he tried to avoid it. He didn't seek out the cases, they came to him, whether he liked it or not. You should be careful, Su Ming, his mother chimed in, her voice full of concern. The more you get involved, the more eyes will be on you. And not all of them will be friendly. Su Ming's father nodded. Exactly. We've already seen some pushback from other powerful families, especially those who feel threatened by our influence. We need to tread carefully. For the rest of the evening, the conversation shifted between lighter topics. Updates on everyone's lives and careers. But Su Ming couldn't shake the underlying tension. He could feel the weight of his family's expectations and the pressure that came with their power. Though he longed for a quiet, lazy life, it seemed that the universe had other plans. By the time the dinner ended, Su Ming's mind was already working, analyzing the situation. His family was strong, but even they weren't immune to the pressures of power struggles and politics. And as much as he tried to distance himself from it all, Su Ming knew that his involvement in future cases would only deepen. He sighed to himself as he left the estate, feeling the familiar pull of responsibility, whether he wanted it or not. Chapter 37, The Uninvited Case. The calm of the evening was something Su Ming had learned to appreciate. After the family dinner, he retreated to his modest apartment in the city, hoping for a peaceful night without any disturbances. Leaning back in his chair, he absent-mindedly scrolled through a list of local events on his phone. Anything to keep his mind occupied and away from the constant tug of crime-solving. He let out a contented sigh, his thoughts wandering. Finally, a quiet night. He muttered to himself, closing his eyes and allowing the quiet hum of the city to lull him into a state of relaxation. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his brief peace. Reluctantly, he glanced at the screen. It was a message from an old friend, Zhao Chun, a police officer who often sought Su Ming's insight on particularly tough cases. Hey, Su Ming, I know you said you're taking a break, but we've got something strange. Major burglary case at an art gallery. High-profile targets, expensive pieces missing. Thought you might want to take a look. Su Ming groaned. He'd promised himself he wouldn't get involved in any more cases for a while. Yet here was a crime, once again knocking at his door, asking for his attention. He put his phone down, staring up at the ceiling as if it could offer him an escape. Maybe if I ignore it, it'll just go away, he said to himself with a hopeful tone. But he knew better than anyone that wasn't how things worked in his world. Like a moth to a flame, crime always found him, no matter how hard he tried to avoid it. His mind began to turn, analyzing the situation. A burglary at an art gallery wasn't exactly a rare occurrence, but the fact that Zhao Chun had reached out meant something about it was off. Expensive art, high-profile targets. The gears in Su Ming's head clicked into place. He knew he'd regret it, but he grabbed his jacket and phone, texting Zhao Chun back. I'll swing by and take a look. Send me the address. The art gallery was only a 15-minute drive away, but Su Ming took his time getting there. As much as he tried to convince himself otherwise, the thrill of solving cases always crept up on him, despite his desire for a lazy, carefree life. His criminal mindset, forged in a past life of manipulation and meticulous planning, often found cracks in the most seemingly flawless schemes. When he arrived, the gallery was buzzing with police activity. Officers moved in and out of the building, and yellow caution tapes sectioned off the entrance. Zhao Chun was waiting by the door, looking relieved when he saw Su Ming approach. Thanks for coming, Zhao said, handing Su Ming a pair of gloves. It's a weird one. No forced entry, but several pieces are missing. The security system didn't pick up anything unusual, and the cameras were conveniently malfunctioning during the time frame the robbery took place. Su Ming raised an eyebrow. Conveniently malfunctioning? Sounds like someone knew exactly how to exploit the system. Zhao nodded. That's what we're thinking. We've got a list of suspects, employees, frequent visitors, but nothing solid yet. Thought you might see something we're missing. Su Ming followed Zhao into the gallery. The once vibrant and bustling space now felt empty, with blank spots where priceless artwork used to hang. The staff looked anxious, huddled in the corner, whispering amongst themselves as officers questioned them one by one. Su Ming took in the scene slowly. His eyes flickered from the empty frames on the wall to the subtle scuff marks on the floor. He was already forming a theory, but he kept it to himself for now. Let me see the security footage, even the malfunctioning parts, Su Ming requested. Zhao handed him a tablet with the footage pulled up. As he suspected, the camera feed went black for exactly 10 minutes. Just enough time for someone to slip in, take what they needed, and disappear. Su Ming frowned. This wasn't random. Whoever did this had intimate knowledge of the gallery's security system. They timed the blackout perfectly, and there's no sign of forced entry. Whoever it was either had a key or knew someone on the inside. He handed the tablet back to Zhao, glancing around the room one more time. But there's something else. Look at the floor, those scuff marks. They're fresh, probably from the heist. The pieces stolen weren't just grabbed and carried away. They were transported carefully, probably by someone with experience in handling valuable art. Zhao's eyes widened. So you're saying it's an inside job? Su Ming nodded. More than likely. Whoever's behind this has done their homework. The timing, the security blackout, the lack of any real trace, it's all too clean. They probably had access to the gallery for some time, and they're familiar with its operations. Zhao looked frustrated. We got a list of employees and frequent visitors. I'll dig deeper into them. Su Ming put a hand on Zhao's shoulder. Don't waste time chasing leads on visitors. Focus on the staff. Someone on the inside is either directly involved or helped the thief gain access. Narrow it down, and you'll find your culprit. As he turned to leave, Zhao called after him. You sure you don't want to stick around for the rest of the investigation? You're good at this, you know. Su Ming smiled lazily. I'm sure. I'll leave the paperwork and grunt work to you. Let me know when you catch them. And with that, he slipped out of the gallery, back into the quiet night. Once again, he'd been dragged into a case he didn't want to handle, but his mind couldn't resist solving the puzzle. Maybe one day, he'd finally have that lazy, peaceful life. But not tonight. Chapter 38, The Vanishing Act. Su Ming had barely settled back into his chair after the art gallery case when his phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Zhao Chun. It was his father. Solve one case, and now you're famous, huh? Su Ming muttered to himself, looking at the caller ID. He picked up the call. Su Ming, we got a situation downtown. His father's deep voice came through the phone. It's a strange one. Multiple people have reported missing persons all at once. It's as if a group of people just vanished into thin air in broad daylight. We can't make sense of it. Su Ming straightened up, frowning. Vanished? You mean no signs of struggle? No evidence of a crime? Exactly, his father replied. It's causing a stir because the missing persons were last seen in public places. Some of them were even caught on camera, but they never made it to their next destination. We need you to take a look. Su Ming rubbed his temples. He could feel another headache coming. All right, I'll be there soon. Downtown Longshan was buzzing with confusion. Media outlets had already caught wind of the disappearances, and the streets were crowded with reporters, police, and curious onlookers. Su Ming slipped past them unnoticed, heading straight to the police station where his father was waiting. Glad you're here, his father said, waving him over. This one's strange. All the victims disappeared in the same area, but at different times throughout the day. We've gone through the footage, but nothing out of the ordinary stands out. Su Ming raised an eyebrow. No suspects? No unusual behavior on the cameras? His father shook his head. None. The victims were just going about their day, shopping, walking home from work, grabbing coffee, and then they simply didn't show up at their next stops. No signs of anyone approaching them or following them. Su Ming's mind raced. This was different from the typical crimes he had been dragged into before. A mass disappearance with no evidence? It felt more like a mystery novel than reality. But he knew better than to dismiss it. Everything had a solution, even if it wasn't immediately clear. "Let me see the footage," Su Ming said, sitting down at one of the stations with a computer. He spent the next hour combing through the security footage. The video showed the missing people walking through the downtown area, seemingly normal. They waved at friends, stopped to check their phones, and went about their lives. But at certain points, they disappeared from camera view, never to return. Su Ming leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the possibilities. "What if?" he mumbled to himself, tapping his fingers against the desk. "It's not about what's on the camera, but what's not on it." He replayed the footage, this time paying more attention to the environment around the victims rather than the victims themselves. Then something caught his eye, a delivery van. The van wasn't unusual in itself, but it appeared in almost every clip where a victim disappeared. It wasn't always in the foreground, but it was there, either passing by or parked in the distance. Its presence was so subtle that it almost blended into the background. But once Su Ming noticed it, he couldn't ignore it. "What's this van?" Su Ming asked, calling over one of the officers. "Looks like a standard delivery vehicle," the officer said, shrugging. "Could belong to any of the courier companies in the area." "Why?" "It's in every clip," Su Ming said, pointing to the screen. "Right before each person disappears, this van is either driving by or parked nearby. I need a closer look at it." The officer pulled up a closer view of the van, zooming in on the license plate. It was partially obscured in some clips, but after piecing together multiple angles, Su Ming managed to get the full number. "Run the plate," he ordered. The search came back quickly. The van belonged to a small-time courier company, but the owner's address led to a dead end. The company had no record of deliveries in the downtown area on the day of the disappearances. "Something's off," Su Ming muttered to himself, piecing together the clues. What if the van isn't delivering anything? His suspicion deepened as he dug into the company's history. It was barely functional, with only one registered employee, an older man who had recently disappeared himself, raising even more questions. Su Ming felt the case getting more complicated the deeper he looked. "What now?" his father asked as they stood outside the building where the van was last tracked. "We're missing something," Su Ming said, scanning the area. A van shows up, people vanish, but no one sees it happen. "It's too clean." His father crossed his arms. "We can't find the van. It's like it just disappeared too." Su Ming glanced at the alleyways, at the blind spots of the surveillance cameras. "They're using these to hide. The van's probably been repainted or switched out by now. This isn't an amateur operation. They've planned this well." His father's expression darkened. "And the missing people? What do they want with them?" Su Ming didn't answer right away. His mind was still racing. Human trafficking? Blackmail? Or something more sinister? He wasn't sure yet, but he had a feeling that the missing persons were alive, at least for now. But time was running out. "We need to find that van," Su Ming said finally. "It's the key to all of this." Chapter 39. The Missing Link. Su Ming stood at the edge of the downtown district, his eyes narrowing as he tried to piece together the mystery of the missing van and its connection to the disappearances. Though his father had offered resources, Su Ming preferred to rely on his mind, sifting through the puzzle bit by bit. He didn't like rushing investigations. He believed in patience, in letting the evidence tell the story. Yet, he couldn't shake the unease that came with knowing multiple people were missing and the police had no leads. Stability first, chaos second, Su Ming mumbled to himself, repeating the mindset that had made him such an unpredictable genius in his past life. He worked to control the disorder in his mind, to focus on what he knew rather than what he didn't. His phone buzzed. It was Zhao Chun. "Su Ming, we have a small breakthrough," Zhao Chun said, sounding slightly out of breath. One of the missing people, a teenager named Li Xia, had an unusual habit of recording her surroundings on her phone. "We recovered her phone data. There's a video clip from moments before she disappeared." That piqued Su Ming's interest. "Send it to me." A few seconds later, the video arrived. It was shaky, as if Li Xia had been holding her phone loosely while walking. The footage showed her wandering downtown, her camera accidentally capturing various people, cars, and stores. Nothing seemed out of place at first. Then, the familiar van appeared in the corner of the frame, just as it had in the surveillance footage. The van's door opened slightly, but the camera cut off before anything could be seen. Su Ming replayed the clip over and over, searching for anything that might offer a clue. His keen eye caught a glimpse of movement inside the van just before the video ended. "It's too clean," Su Ming muttered, his instincts screaming that this wasn't a random act. He began piecing together a theory. If this group was organized, they would have safe houses or secret locations to hold the victims. The van had to lead somewhere close, somewhere within the range of the disappearances. He quickly opened his map and pinpointed the areas where the victims had vanished. They were all in a 2-kilometer radius. It was a small range, but filled with countless alleys, warehouses, and abandoned buildings. Su Ming's father stepped up behind him. "Any leads?" "The van," Su Ming replied, tapping the map. "I think they're using it to move the victims to a location nearby, somewhere they won't be noticed." "You think the victims are still alive?" his father asked, his voice filled with concern. Su Ming nodded slowly. "For now. But the longer we wait, the riskier it becomes." The investigation team fanned out across the area, looking for anything that might lead them to the missing people. Su Ming led his small group, moving methodically from alley to alley, checking each one for clues. After hours of searching, they finally found something: a strip of torn fabric caught on a metal fence behind an old, dilapidated warehouse. It was small, barely noticeable, but it matched the description of the clothing worn by one of the victims. "They were here," Su Ming said quietly, signaling the team to approach the building. His father stood nearby, barking orders to the other officers, but Su Ming ignored the noise. His focus was on the entrance to the warehouse. The van could have pulled in through the side, hidden from view of the street. The lack of recent tire tracks meant they hadn't been here recently, but Su Ming knew they were getting closer. Inside, the warehouse was dusty and filled with old machinery. A perfect place to hide someone or something without attracting attention. Su Ming scanned the area, looking for any signs of recent activity. It was then that he noticed something strange. A patch of the floor near the back looked newer, as if it had been replaced recently. "Over here," he called to his father, who quickly joined him. "What is it?" his father asked. Su Ming knelt, brushing the dust aside. This floor was redone. They might have hidden something beneath it. One of the officers brought over tools, and after a few minutes of work, they uncovered a hatch leading down to a hidden basement. Su Ming's heart raced. He hadn't expected this, but it confirmed his suspicions. This was no ordinary kidnapping case. Whoever was behind this had gone to great lengths to stay hidden. They descended into the basement, finding a dimly lit underground room. And there, to Su Ming's relief, were the missing people, alive but shaken, tied up and blindfolded. His team moved quickly, untying them and helping them to safety. As Su Ming surveyed the scene, he couldn't help but feel a familiar sense of satisfaction. He had cracked the case, but the methodical nature of the kidnappings bothered him. "This isn't over," Su Ming whispered to himself as he scanned the room. There was more to this than just random abductions. Hours later, back at home, Su Ming lay on his bed, eyes staring up at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was lurking beneath the surface. The van, the hidden basement, the organized nature of the kidnappings, it all pointed to something more sinister. But for now, the case was closed and the victims were safe. "Just once," Su Ming sighed. "I wish I could spend a day without a case falling into my lap." His phone buzzed again. He groaned. Another case. Chapter 40. The burglary beneath the surface. The cool evening breeze swept through the streets of Longchen as Su Ming strolled lazily through the neighborhood. He had successfully solved the disappearance case just the day before, and all he wanted now was a moment of peace. The night was quiet, offering him a rare sense of calm. As usual, crime was never too far from Su Ming's vicinity. His reputation as a crime magnate had grown among those closest to him, even if they said it jokingly. He liked to brush it off, but the truth was that trouble always found him, whether he wanted it or not. Today, it seemed, would be no different. Walking past a row of small shops, Su Ming noticed something peculiar. One of the stores, a high-end antique shop, had its front door slightly ajar. Its lights were out, and the street was eerily quiet. His instincts immediately kicked in. "Just keep walking, Su Ming. It's not your problem," he muttered to himself, hoping to distance himself from the inevitable. But curiosity got the better of him, as it always did. He stopped a few meters away, leaning against a lamppost, eyes fixed on the shop's entrance. Something was off. This was a wealthy neighborhood, not the kind of place where store owners would forget to lock up. Unable to resist, Su Ming casually approached the shop, his mind racing with possibilities. He peeked through the partially open door. The dim light inside revealed a scene of chaos. Shelves overturned, glass display cases shattered, and valuable artifacts missing. A burglary, Su Ming thought, stepping inside cautiously. He could still smell the faint scent of someone having been there recently. He glanced around, assessing the situation. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were after. It wasn't a random smash and grab. The expensive jewelry and watches were untouched, but the older, rare items, artifacts and scrolls, were gone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Su Ming instinctively ducked behind a counter, just in time to hear footsteps from the back room. Still here, he thought, a small smirk forming on his face. Now, this is interesting. It seemed the burglar hadn't finished the job yet. The intruder, unaware of Su Ming's presence, worked quickly in the back. Su Ming quietly made his way toward the back room, careful not to make any noise. He was certain now that this wasn't a random crime. The way the items had been selected, the efficiency, it pointed to a professional. He peered around the corner, spotting the burglar, masked, dressed in black, and focused entirely on breaking into a safe hidden behind a large painting. Su Ming noted the skill with which the thief worked, cracking the safe with precision. No amateur could do that. "Let's make this fun," Su Ming thought, casually leaning against the doorframe. "Need a hand?" he called out, his voice echoing through the room. The burglar froze for a split second before spinning around, startled. Their eyes widened in shock, but they quickly composed themselves, trying to hide their surprise. It was clear they hadn't expected anyone to be here. "Who are you?" the burglar demanded, pulling a small knife from their belt. "Just an innocent bystander," Su Ming replied, his voice relaxed. "But it looks like you've got a little too much on your plate." The burglar hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Su Ming's laid-back demeanor seemed to throw them off. They were used to fear and panic from those who interrupted their work, not indifference. "How about you put that knife away, and we talk about this?" Su Ming suggested, eyeing the safe. "Seems like you're after something important." The burglar, sensing the conversation wasn't going in their favor, lunged forward, knife in hand. Su Ming sidestepped easily, tripping them as they passed, sending the thief crashing into a display case. The knife skidded across the floor, well out of reach. "That was unnecessary," Su Ming sighed, leaning down to pick up the knife. He twirled it in his hand for a moment before tossing it aside. "Now, where were we?" The burglar groaned, trying to regain their balance. Su Ming stepped closer, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. He could see now that the thief wasn't just after money. They were after something specific, something hidden in that safe. "What's inside?" Su Ming asked, kneeling next to the would-be thief. "You wouldn't go through all this trouble for nothing." The burglar glared at him, but remained silent. "Fine, don't tell me," Su Ming said with a shrug. "But I'll find out sooner or later." By the time the authorities arrived, the burglar was long gone, thanks to Su Ming, who had let them escape after realizing they weren't your average crook. He had watched them bolt through the back alleys, making a mental note of their face despite the mask. There would be time to deal with them later. As the police surveyed the scene, Su Ming pretended to be an innocent bystander who had stumbled upon the burglary. He wasn't interested in the praise or attention, but he knew his father would be hearing about it soon. Another case solved without trying, Su Ming sighed. "I need to find a quieter part of town." He turned to leave when the shop owner arrived, grateful but shaken. The police questioned Su Ming briefly, and he gave them just enough to keep them satisfied, leaving out any mention of the thief's escape. As Su Ming walked home, his thoughts wandered. Why had the burglar been so interested in that particular safe? What could be worth the risk? Another mystery for another day, Su Ming decided. Chapter 41. The Vanishing Family Heirloom. It had been a quiet week since Su Ming's encounter with the antique shop burglar, and for once, he felt like he could enjoy a few days of peace. He was sprawled out on the couch in his family's large living room, pretending to be deeply interested in a book, when the reality was that he hadn't turned the page in over 10 minutes. His father, Chief Su, had just come back from work and was in the kitchen with Su Ming's mother, having a light conversation about the latest developments in a high-profile case. Su Ming had overheard bits of it, but he wasn't interested. Crime had a way of finding him whether he paid attention or not, and for now, he wanted nothing to do with it. Just relax. Let the world pass you by for a bit, he told himself. It wasn't long before his illusion of peace was shattered. His phone buzzed, vibrating loudly against the coffee table. He ignored it at first, hoping that whoever was calling would get the hint and hang up. But it continued buzzing persistently. With a sigh, Su Ming picked up the phone, glancing at the caller ID. It was an unfamiliar number, and his curiosity piqued. Who is this? Su Ming thought as he answered the call. A frantic voice greeted him on the other end. Su Ming? It's Zhang Wei. I need your help. Su Ming frowned. Zhang Wei was a close family friend, a businessman who had worked with Su Ming's father on several occasions. He was known for his calm demeanor, but right now, his voice was anything but composed. What happened? Su Ming asked, already feeling the pull toward another case, despite his inner protests. It's my family heirloom. It's been stolen, Zhang Wei blurted out, his voice trembling with panic. I don't know what to do. The police have no leads, and it's irreplaceable. Su Ming pinched the bridge of his nose. He had been hoping for a quiet week, but it seemed the universe had other plans. There was no way he could ignore Zhang Wei's plea for help, especially with how desperate he sounded. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Su Ming said, reluctantly getting up from the couch. Zhang Wei's mansion was nestled in one of the wealthier parts of the city, surrounded by tall iron gates and sprawling gardens. Su Ming arrived to find Zhang Wei pacing anxiously outside, wringing his hands together. Su Ming, thank you for coming, Zhang Wei said, rushing over as soon as Su Ming stepped out of the car. Calm down, Uncle Zhang. Tell me what happened, Su Ming said, his tone even and composed. Zhang Wei led Su Ming into the mansion, explaining the situation as they walked through the ornate halls. The heirloom in question was a centuries-old jade pendant that had been passed down through Zhang Wei's family for generations. It had been kept in a glass display case in the mansion's private gallery, a room reserved for the family's most valuable possessions. 2 days ago, the pendant had vanished without a trace. There were no signs of forced entry, and none of the security cameras had captured any suspicious activity. The police had been investigating, but so far, they hadn't found any leads. I don't understand how it could have happened, Zhang Wei said, his voice heavy with frustration. The pendant was secured in the case, and there's no way anyone could have gotten in without being noticed. Su Ming followed Zhang Wei into the gallery, his eyes scanning the room. The display case where the pendant had been kept was empty, the glass still intact. Su Ming's mind began to piece together the possibilities. No broken glass, no forced entry, yet it's missing, Su Ming muttered to himself, stepping closer to the case. Exactly, Zhang Wei said, standing beside him. The only people who have access to this room are me and my family. And I trust all of them completely. Su Ming nodded but said nothing. Trust wasn't something that solved cases. He had learned that long ago. He bent down, examining the base of the display case closely. His sharp eyes caught something most people would have missed, small, almost imperceptible scratches on the lock. This lock was picked, Su Ming said, straightening up. Whoever did this was a professional. But more than that, they knew exactly what they were looking for. Zhang Wei's face paled. A professional thief? Su Ming nodded. The lock isn't broken, but it's been tampered with. They didn't want to leave any obvious signs of a break-in, so they were careful. Whoever did this must have known about the pendant. Who could have known? Zhang Wei asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Only a handful of people even knew about the heirloom. Su Ming didn't answer immediately, his mind racing through the possibilities. This wasn't just an opportunistic burglary. Someone had planned this carefully, likely gaining knowledge about the heirloom and the security measures surrounding it. Who's been in the house recently? Su Ming asked, crossing his arms as he considered the next step. Zhang Wei listed off a few names, family members, friends, and a few business associates. Nothing out of the ordinary. But Su Ming was starting to see a pattern. Whoever took the pendant knew the house well and had inside information. We need to check your staff as well, Su Ming added, already forming a plan. They could have been bribed or coerced into providing information. Zhang Wei looked startled but agreed. I'll call them in right away. Over the next hour, Su Ming interviewed the staff, cross-referencing their statements with Zhang Wei's account of the timeline. Nothing seemed out of place until Su Ming noticed a subtle inconsistency in one of the staff members' stories, a young maid named Lu Yin. Her nervousness was apparent as Su Ming questioned her, and it wasn't long before she slipped up. She had mentioned an unfamiliar name, a man who had supposedly come to the house for a business meeting with Zhang Wei 2 weeks ago. But Zhang Wei had no memory of such a meeting. Who is this man? Su Ming asked, his voice calm but sharp. Lu Yin stammered, her face turning pale. I don't know. He offered me money to tell him when the family would be out of the house. He said it was just a harmless favor. Su Ming's eyes narrowed. Did you tell him about the heirloom? Lu Yin nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I didn't know he would steal it. Please, I didn't mean for this to happen. Zhang Wei was furious, but Su Ming remained focused. Now they had a lead. The man who had bribed Lu Yin would be the key to finding the heirloom, and Su Ming had every intention of tracking him down. Chapter 42, Tracking the Mastermind. The next day, Su Ming found himself sitting in the corner of a bustling cafe, sipping a cup of coffee while scrolling through his phone. His thoughts, however, were far from his surroundings. The theft at Zhang Wei's mansion had given him more questions than answers, and while he had uncovered part of the mystery, the most critical piece, who the mysterious thief was, still eluded him. He had tasked Zhang Wei's security team with following up on Lu Yan's statement, but Su Ming knew better than to rely entirely on them. The thief had planned the heist carefully, which meant that tracking him down would require a more delicate touch. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from an anonymous number, one of the many he had connected to his information network. Got a lead on your jade thief. My name's Zhao Rue. He's been operating out of the West End, seen around a warehouse by the docks. Be careful, this guy's slippery. Su Ming smirked, sending a quick reply before pocketing his phone. It was always nice when his network came through with solid intel. Zhao Rue, the name rang a bell. He had heard it before, likely about previous high-profile thefts, but the man had always managed to stay one step ahead of the law. Not for long, Su Ming muttered to himself as he stood up, leaving his half-finished coffee behind. The West End was a far cry from the lavish neighborhood where Zhang Wei's mansion stood. The streets were narrow and crowded with warehouses and old factories, many of which had long since been abandoned. It was the perfect place for someone like Zhao Rue to hide out. Remote, yet accessible, with plenty of escape routes if things went south. Su Ming parked a few blocks away from the docks and made his way toward the warehouse his contact had mentioned. As he walked, he kept his hands casually in his pockets, his eyes scanning the area. His lazy gait masked the sharpness of his mind, which was already calculating the best approach. Arriving at the warehouse, he saw that it was as run down as the rest of the area. Rusted metal doors, broken windows, and a faded sign that no longer served any purpose. He slipped around the back, where a side door was slightly ajar, a sign that someone had been careless, or perhaps too confident in their ability to avoid detection. Su Ming entered the warehouse quietly, his footsteps barely audible on the dusty floor. Inside, it was dark, with only the faint glow of light filtering in through the grimy windows. He moved deeper into the building, his senses alert, and then he heard the sound of voices. Low, hushed but unmistakable. Su Ming followed the sound to a large open area where several crates were stacked haphazardly. In the center of the room, a group of men were gathered around a table, talking in muffled tones. Zhao Rue was there, just as his contact had said. He was a tall, thin man with a sharp, almost predatory look to him, his eyes constantly darting around as if he expected trouble at any moment. The other men were his accomplices, likely involved in the planning or execution of the heist. Su Ming leaned against one of the crates, listening in. Zhao Rui was discussing the sale of the jade pendant, which he planned to move out of the country within the next few days. It was typical criminal talk: how to avoid detection, who to bribe, and how much to ask for the stolen goods. Su Ming allowed them to finish their conversation before stepping out of the shadows, his voice breaking the silence. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The group turned toward him, startled by his sudden appearance. Zhao Rui's eyes narrowed as he sized Su Ming up, clearly not recognizing him. "Who the hell are you?" Su Ming shrugged, his expression relaxed. "Just someone who's good at finding things and people." Zhao Rui snorted, his confidence returning. "You've got some nerve showing up here alone, kid. Do you even know who you're dealing with?" Su Ming tilted his head as if considering the question. "Yeah, a guy who's about to regret crossing paths with me." The men around Zhao Rui shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was off. But Zhao Rui wasn't easily intimidated. He gestured to his men, who began advancing on Su Ming. Su Ming sighed, cracking his neck lazily. "You know, I was hoping to avoid any trouble today. But I guess you guys don't leave me much choice." In an instant, the calm, easygoing facade Su Ming had maintained disappeared. His movements became swift, precise, and shockingly efficient. The first man to reach him swung a fist, but Su Ming dodged effortlessly, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back before kicking him to the ground. Another came at him with a knife, but Su Ming disarmed him with a quick flick of his wrist, sending the knife clattering to the floor. Within seconds, the man was on his knees, gasping for air as Su Ming delivered a sharp blow to his midsection. The rest of Zhao Rui's men hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. They weren't used to dealing with someone like Su Ming, someone who could fight with both precision and ease, all while looking like he couldn't be bothered to break a sweat. Zhao Rui, however, wasn't about to give up. He drew a gun from his jacket, aiming it directly at Su Ming. "You're fast, but let's see how you handle this." Su Ming's eyes flicked to the gun, his mind racing through his options. In a split second, he calculated the distance between them and the likelihood of disarming Zhao Rui before he could pull the trigger. It wasn't great, but it wasn't impossible either. Just as Zhao Rui's finger tightened on the trigger, Su Ming made his move. He darted to the side, grabbing a nearby crate and using it as a shield. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse, but it missed its mark. Before Zhao Rui could fire again, Su Ming was on him, knocking the gun from his hand and sending him sprawling to the ground. Zhao Rui groaned, clutching his arm as Su Ming loomed over him. "You're done," Su Ming said, his voice cold and final. The police arrived shortly after, rounding up Zhao Rui and his men. Su Ming watched from the sidelines, his hands back in his pockets, his expression once again lazy and disinterested. Chief Su approached him, giving him a nod of approval. "Good work, son. You handled that well." Su Ming shrugged. It wasn't much, just another day. But even as he downplayed the situation, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There were more criminals like Zhao Rui out there, more mysteries to solve, more challenges to face. And no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, trouble seemed to have a way of finding him. Chapter 43. The Calm Before the Storm. After the intense confrontation at the warehouse and the successful capture of Zhao Rui, Su Ming found himself back home. The case had wrapped up quicker than expected, and the stolen jade pendant was safely returned to Zhang Wei, earning Su Ming another quiet nod of approval from his father. But for now, all Su Ming wanted was some peace, a reprieve from the chaos that seemed to cling to him. Sitting in his room, Su Ming lazily reclined in his chair, staring out of the window. The soft afternoon sunlight bathed the room in a warm glow. From downstairs, he could hear the faint sounds of his family going about their day. His father, Chief Su, was likely reviewing case files, his mother prepping for her next surgery, and one of his sisters humming a tune in the kitchen. It was a rare moment of tranquility in the Su household, and Su Ming was keen to savor it. Yet, even with the calm around him, Su Ming's mind wouldn't rest. His thoughts drifted back to Zhao Rui and his operation. While the thief was now in custody, Su Ming had a nagging feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye. Zhao Rui wasn't the type to operate independently. There had to be a larger network behind him, perhaps even more dangerous individuals pulling the strings. But for now, it would have to wait. After all, Su Ming had earned himself a break. He was about to close his eyes when his phone buzzed again. With a sigh, he picked it up, half expecting another lead on some case or criminal activity. Instead, the screen displayed a familiar name. Su Mei's fifth sister, the captain of the Special Forces. Su Ming. Hey, you've been too quiet. Want to grab dinner later? A slight smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It wasn't often that Su Ming reached out just to spend time with him. She was always busy with her rigorous training schedules, rarely having time for casual family gatherings. He quickly replied, Su Ming, sure. Where? Su Ming. Mom's favorite place. Be there at 7. Su Ming pocketed his phone and leaned back in his chair, glad for the chance to do something normal for a change. It wasn't often that he got to enjoy family time without some case hanging over his head. Besides, dinner with Su Ming was always interesting. She was the only one in the family who could give him a run for his money when it came to strategy and tactics, though in a far more physical way. Later that evening, Su Ming arrived at the restaurant, a small, cozy place tucked away in one of the quieter parts of the city. It was a favorite of their mother's, known for its comforting home-cooked meals. As he walked in, he spotted Su Ming already seated at a corner table, her usual sharp, no-nonsense demeanor softened slightly by the relaxed atmosphere. You're on time, she remarked as Su Ming took a seat across from her. I figured if I didn't show up, you'd hunt me down, Su Ming quipped, earning a rare chuckle from his sister. They ordered their meals and settled into a comfortable silence, both enjoying the temporary escape from their demanding lives. Su Ming had always been the most disciplined of the siblings, her time in the Special Forces shaping her into a formidable figure. Despite that, she had a soft spot for her younger brother, even if she didn't always show it outright. So, Su Ming began, breaking the silence. Heard about the case with the jade pendant. Sounds like you handled it well. Su Ming shrugged. It was nothing too complicated. Just another thief who thought he could get away with it. Su Ming raised an eyebrow. Still, you're getting quite a reputation. Even Dad's impressed. Su Ming waved her off. Dad's just glad I'm not causing trouble. A smirk played on Su Ming's lips. Trouble finds you whether you like it or not. They shared a knowing look. It was true. No matter how hard Su Ming tried to avoid getting involved in police work, something always seemed to drag him back in. Whether it was family connections, unexpected cases, or just plain bad luck, Su Ming couldn't escape it. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Su Ming allowed himself to relax. It wasn't often he got to simply enjoy a meal without the weight of his criminal investigations hanging over him. He listened as Su Ming recounted some of her more humorous training exercises, subtly teasing him about how he wouldn't last a day in her regiment. In return, he shared exaggerated stories about the mundane aspects of his day-to-day life, playing up his laziness to get a laugh out of her. But as the meal progressed, Su Ming's phone buzzed once more, this time with a different tone, one reserved for high-priority contacts. He glanced down, his expression darkening slightly. Work? Su Ming asked, already knowing the answer. Something like that, Su Ming muttered, standing up. Looks like dinner's over. Su Ming gave him a mock salute. Be careful, little brother. Su Ming nodded and left the restaurant, his mind already shifting gears. The message had been brief, but it was clear. A string of burglaries had hit the affluent districts of Longshan, and the local police were stumped. Several high-profile families had been targeted, and tensions were rising. With no clear suspects and minimal leads, they were requesting Su Ming's help. Looks like I'm back to work, he muttered to himself as he hailed a cab. Chapter 44. The Silent Intruder. Su Ming sat in the back of the cab, staring out the window as the city lights blurred by. His mind wandered to the latest message. Another case, another disruption to his quiet life. It was becoming routine by now. He sighed, leaning back in his seat. Despite his best efforts to remain uninvolved, the city's criminals seemed to have a strange magnetism toward him. The case he was heading toward was particularly intriguing, though. A series of burglaries had targeted some of the wealthiest families in Longchin. These weren't ordinary break-ins. They were highly coordinated, almost professional. Expensive jewelry, rare art, and even confidential documents had vanished without a trace. The police had been working for weeks, but every lead turned up cold. Now they were looking to Su Ming for help. The cab pulled up in front of the latest crime scene, a luxurious mansion belonging to the Shin family, one of Longchin's most influential. Flashing police lights illuminated the large, gated estate as officers swarmed the area. Su Ming stepped out, taking a deep breath. Another night, another case. As he approached the entrance, one of the officers, a familiar face, nodded at him. "Glad you could make it, Su Ming." He gave a half-hearted nod in return. "What's the situation?" "Same as before," the officer explained. "No forced entry, no signs of struggle. Whatever they took this time, they were in and out without leaving a trace." Su Ming sighed internally. "Show me the scene." Inside the mansion, Su Ming quickly scanned the area. The grand foyer was immaculate, not a single thing out of place. It was eerie, almost too perfect. He followed the officer through the hallways until they arrived at a study room, where the owner of the house, Mr. Shun, was pacing. "Mr. Shun," the officer began, "this is Su Ming. He's here to assist with the investigation." Mr. Shun barely acknowledged Su Ming's presence, still rattled from the intrusion. "They took everything valuable in that safe," he muttered, pointing to a large, open vault in the corner of the room. Su Ming walked over to it. The safe was high-end and nearly impossible to crack without the right tools or knowledge. But from what he could see, there were no obvious signs of tampering. He glanced over at Mr. Shun. "When did you last check the contents of the safe?" "This morning," Shun replied. "I check it every day, and there's no one else who could have accessed it. Only my staff, but they're loyal. They wouldn't dare touch anything in here." Su Ming didn't press further. He wasn't one to dismiss possibilities, but gut feelings rarely led him astray. He crouched down in front of the safe, inspecting the area for any details the officers might have missed. After a few moments, he noticed something small, almost unnoticeable, a faint smudge near the keypad, a gloved fingerprint. He carefully examined it, noting its size and positioning. Whoever had left it was meticulous, yet they had still made a slight mistake. Su Ming stood up, his mind racing as he pieced together what he knew. The burglars were professionals, but even professionals slipped up when they grew overconfident. "You said there were no signs of forced entry," Su Ming remarked, looking at the officer. The officer nodded. "None that we could find." Su Ming stared at the keypad again. "They didn't need to force their way in. They had access. How's that possible?" Mr. Shin asked, his tone a mix of anger and confusion. "No one has the code to that safe but me." Su Ming glanced back at Mr. Shun, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Then someone must have found a way to get it." Back at the police station, Su Ming sat down to review the security footage from the Shin estate. As he sped through the hours of recordings, he noticed something strange, a small gap in the footage, lasting only a few minutes. It was barely noticeable, but to Su Ming, it stood out like a beacon. "Hacking," he muttered under his breath. Someone had tampered with the security system, erasing just enough footage to cover their tracks, but leaving the rest intact to avoid suspicion. It was clever, but not clever enough. He pulled up the footage from the previous burglary cases, comparing them. Sure enough, there were similar gaps in the recordings at each location, all lasting a few minutes. The pattern was clear now. The same group had hit all the houses, using the same method to hide their actions. "They're smart," Su Ming thought, "but they're getting sloppy." His next step was to dig deeper into the Shun family's inner circle. If there was someone feeding information to the burglars, he needed to find them. He started with the security company responsible for monitoring the Shun estate, cross-referencing employees who might have access to the system. It didn't take long for a name to stand out. A technician who had been on-site at all the targeted homes a few days before each burglary. Su Ming's instincts kicked in. He was close. The following day, Su Ming paid a visit to the security company, meeting with the technician in question, a man named Li Wei. Su Ming kept his demeanor casual, masking his suspicions behind a facade of curiosity. I'm just here to ask a few questions about the recent burglaries, Su Ming said as he sat down across from Li Wei. You've been working on the security systems for most of the victims, haven't you? Li Wei shifted slightly in his seat. Yeah, but I don't know anything about the break-ins. I just installed the systems. Su Ming nodded, his expression unreadable. I see. And you don't recall anything unusual during your visits? No tampering with the systems. No strange requests from the homeowners? Li Wei shook his head quickly. Nothing like that. Su Ming leaned back, letting a brief silence settle between them. He observed the man, watching for any sign of nervousness or deceit. Li Wei was good at hiding his emotions, but Su Ming had seen this before. There was a tension beneath the surface, a subtle unease that betrayed him. I appreciate your cooperation, Su Ming said finally, standing up. We'll be in touch. As he left the building, Su Ming's mind was already working on the next move. He knew Li Wei was involved, but he needed more proof, something to tie him directly to the burglaries. Chapter 45, Threads of Deception. Su Ming paced his small, cluttered office, his thoughts racing. The lead on Li Wei was promising, but he knew better than to rely on gut instinct alone. He needed hard evidence. But for now, he had to bide his time, let the investigation simmer while he tackled other matters. Despite his usual laziness, fate had a knack for pulling him back into the fray. That afternoon, Su Ming received another call. This time, it wasn't about burglary. Instead, it was a kidnapping case. A young girl from a prominent family had been taken, and her parents had received a ransom demand. The police had been working around the clock, but with no substantial leads. Once again, they were turning to Su Ming, knowing his knack for unraveling the seemingly unsolvable. As he arrived at the scene, Su Ming quickly assessed the situation. The house was eerily silent, the parents distraught, surrounded by officers trying to calm them down. Su Ming felt a pang of empathy, but his face remained impassive. The father, Mr. Zhao, immediately approached Su Ming. Please, you've got to help us. They took my daughter, and they're asking for an insane amount of money. I'll pay anything, but I just want her back safely. Su Ming nodded, his mind already processing the details. What can you tell me about the demand? They called, but they blocked the number. They want the money by tomorrow night. If I don't deliver, they said they'd kill her. His voice broke as he spoke. Su Ming's eyes narrowed. Did they specify a location for the exchange? Yes, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. But the police have already scouted it out, and it's been abandoned for years. There's no guarantee they'll actually be there. Su Ming nodded slowly. They're likely playing with your emotions, trying to scare you into paying without thinking. But we won't let it come to that. Later that night, Su Ming sat at his desk, poring over the ransom call recording. The kidnappers had been careful, but not perfect. As he analyzed the voice, he noticed something subtle, a background noise, faint but distinct. He replayed it several times, enhancing the sound. It was the whirring of machinery, possibly industrial. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he cross-referenced industrial areas in the city, narrowing down locations that matched the sound profile. After a few hours of analysis, he had a list of potential hideouts, mostly abandoned factories. One in particular stood out, located near an old shipping yard. Su Ming decided it was worth a closer look. The next day, he visited the site under the guise of inspecting it for unrelated reasons. As he wandered through the decaying halls of the factory, he could feel the tension in the air. It was quiet, too quiet. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something, a small piece of fabric caught on a jagged pipe. Kneeling down, he inspected the fabric. It was fresh, torn recently. His instincts flared. He was close. Careful not to make any sudden moves, Su Ming ventured further into the factory, his senses heightened. As he rounded a corner, he heard voices, faint but distinct. He hid behind a stack of old crates, listening intently. The kidnappers were arguing, one of them angry about the ransom not being enough. Su Ming's mind worked quickly, memorizing the layout and counting the number of voices. There were at least 4 of them. Hours later, Su Ming returned to the police station with the information. They're holed up in the abandoned factory near the shipping yard, he reported. They're holding the girl there. I counted at least 4 of them. The officers quickly organized a raid. and Su Ming was on hand to guide them through the building. The operation went off without a hitch. The kidnappers were caught off guard, and the girl was rescued unharmed. Su Ming, as usual, remained in the background, letting the police take credit for the operation. But just as he thought he could finally take a breather, another case landed on his desk. This time, it wasn't kidnapping or burglary. It was a series of seemingly random arsons across the city, each one targeting small businesses. The fires were always set at night, and by the time the fire department arrived, the buildings were nothing more than smoldering ruins. The arsonist had been eluding capture for weeks. Each fire seemed unrelated to the last, and there was no apparent motive. The police had been stumped, unable to find any pattern. Su Ming, however, had a different approach. He requested all the files on the arson cases, along with a list of the affected businesses. As he studied the data, a subtle pattern began to emerge. The businesses were all in neighborhoods that had recently been earmarked for redevelopment. It was a classic case of arson for profit. Someone wanted the land cleared, and they were using fire to drive the business owners out. Su Ming's investigation led him to a local real estate mogul with a shady reputation. The man had been quietly buying up properties in the areas affected by the fires, always offering just enough to make the owners sell. But those who refused? Their businesses mysteriously went up in flames shortly after. With this new lead, Su Ming gathered enough evidence to confront the mogul. The man, of course, denied any involvement, but Su Ming had the proof. With the police backing him up, the arsonist was caught, a professional hired by the mogul to burn down the businesses.